13 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first guy, Michael Badgery, the Indianapolis Colts. Badgery, I speak about him a decent amount of times this season here, but this guy's still underowned, in my opinion. He's still available in 59% of fantasy leagues. Here's Badgery, and he's pretty much automatic for a 7 to 10 fantasy point each and every week. Week 9 versus Jets, 9 fantasy points. Week 10 versus Jacksonville, 9. Week 11 at Buffalo, 11. And Week 12 versus the Bucks, 8 fantasy points. So this week here, the Colts are going to be living early and often in the red zone at a weak Houston Texan team. And once again, Badgery easily anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. And he's definitely a kicker I would start this week. The next kicker is Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So last week here was the old goose egg for Greg Joseph and fantasy owners. He didn't have anything in that ball game. He missed an extra point and he hit 2 extra points. So obviously in most leagues it's negative fantasy points for missing an extra point, and that's what happened with Greg Joseph. But right here in week 13, I think he bounces back. He's got a great matchup at the Lions that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. They can't stop no one. The Vikings, they're going to be in the red zone a lot and the end zone a lot with their high-powered offense. And I think Joseph bounces back this week and has a good game, because the games before him having 0, Week 8 versus Dallas, 11, Week 9 at Baltimore, 7, Week 10 at the Chargers, 10, and Week 11 versus Green Bay, 7. So anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points is definitely going to happen, I think, this week. The next guy I would start is Matt Prater of the Arizona Cardinals. So Prater widely available in a bunch of fantasy leagues at 70% after being dropped going into his bye week in Week 12. So Prater's with a high-powered offense. I know the last 4 or 5 weeks he really hasn't contributed or done much for fantasy owners. Week 9 at San Francisco, 6. Week 10 versus the Panthers, 5. Week 11 at Seattle, 5. But Week 12 had the bye. In Week 13 here at the Bears, they give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. And I can see the Bears here bending but though breaking at home a little at Soldier Field, where they're going to have to settle for some field goals. So right here this week, I think Matt Prater gets going and gets the job done. And he's a kicker this week that I say gets anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points as well. And I would start him. The next kicker is Evan Mcpherson of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Evan Mcpherson, he's been pretty solid this year, in my opinion, in his rookie year. And this week he's got a great matchup in Week 13 at the Chargers that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers. Week 9 versus Cleveland for him, 3. Week 11 at Vegas, 19. And Week 12 versus Pittsburgh, 13 fantasy points. So right here, Week 13, it's going to be a shootout, in my opinion, with the Chargers and the Bengals. And I think, once again, Evan Mcpherson finds double digits, and he's a kicker widely available right now in 85% of fantasy leagues. And the 5th and final kicker I would start this week here is Matthew Gay of the Los Angeles Rams. So Gay, he got dropped in a decent amount of fantasy leagues a few weeks ago, so he's available in 40% of fantasy leagues, and he's got a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars that give up the 9th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So Gay, the last few games, Week 9 versus Tennessee, 11, Week 10 at San Francisco, 4, and Week 12 at Green Bay, 8. So versus Jacksonville, I think it's safe to say he could score anywhere from 7 to 9 fantasy points, because they're going to be living in the red zone. This Ram team's got to bounce back after losing 3 in a row. And Matt Gay's been a pretty good kicker this season, so I think he's a kicker you start. So that's a few kickers I would start for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.